Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. Today's speaker is Omar Dewachi, Hrdy Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute and Associate Professor of Medical Anthropology and Global Health at Rutgers University. Trained as a doctor in Iraq and in anthropology at Harvard, Omar has spent almost 2 decades working to produce groundbreaking interdisciplinary research and writing on the connections between medicine, politics, and history. Specifically, Omar's work looks at the human and environmental effects of decades of war in Iraq and in the broader Middle East. Omar has published in a wide range of scholarly journals, from medicine to global health to anthropology and the arts. His first book, Ungovernable Lives, traces the colonial and post-colonial history of Iraqi medicine during the 20th century. It examines Iraqi's government investment in medical doctors as agents of statecraft and how years of wars and sanctions damaged medicine in Iraq and the country itself. At Radcliffe, Omar continues to work on his ethnographic project, When Wounds Travel, with the intention of producing a manuscript that chronicles the past 20 years of anthropological research and societal medicine work on war injury, conflict medicine, and displacement across the Middle East. More specifically, the work documents the widespread of conflict-related injuries and antimicrobial resistance in the context of the reconfiguration of healthcare and the rise of humanitarian geographies under decades of protracted conflicts in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. His work has culminated in the founding of a conflict management program of the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, a one-of-a-kind center located in the Global South, dedicated to the interdisciplinary study of the physical, psychological, and societal manifestation of war wounds. The timing of today's talk is very appropriate, as we remember this month the 20th anniversary of the US occupation of Iraq. When not teaching or doing research on troubling matters, Omar seeks feeding his soul through performing music, both as a trained oud player and an improviser of electronic and experimental music. He goes under the moniker Puppets of Babylon. I would check him out. I'm delighted to welcome Omar to the podium.
Thank you, Claudia, for this amazing presentation, and thanks for this amazing group of people that I've been spending all the time with, and I'm really very grateful to have this opportunity to be with all of you. It's been an incredible year, eye-opening at many levels, and a kind of an experience of friendships that I hope will last for a really, really long time. So today's conversation that I have for you, the kind of the talk that I have for today has to do with kind of looking back at some of the work that I've been doing as a medical anthropologist, as a social medicine practitioner, working in the Middle East, specifically on Iraq, working on Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, a kind of a geography that I will be calling the kind of the east of the Mediterranean. So, but let me kind of jump into this story from the beginning, and I'll come to talk a little bit more about what to be expected from this talk. I just returned back from Iraq, from spending about 1 month or 3 weeks actually in Mosul, where my family is originally from. I've returned there with my father, who basically have left there a long time ago, and we both have not been back to the city in about 35 years, since they're kind of the early 1990s. And while I was there, the news woke up on February 6th to the shaking of the bed and the chandeliers and the lights because of the earthquake in southern Turkey and in northeast Syria. And this region, of course, this is not the first time an earthquake happens there, but actually in a more troubling way, this region has also seen a kind of displacement and kind of the effect and the cost of long-term or a decade of war happening in neighboring Syria. In Turkey, in that region, the south of Turkey, there are around 2 million displaced Syrians living in that area. And in northeast Syria, where there was a kind of a divide between government-controlled and opposition-controlled area, this disaster really exacerbated this huge problem of overpopulation happening due to this kind of displacement of many of these populations during this decade of war. We were about 700 kilometers southeast of the earthquake. And I was staying in the city of Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. That basically, if you see the map here, the city is divided by the river Tigris into the left side and the right side of the city, and I'll explain why this was very important. This city, from 2014 to 2017, was the center of one of the largest urban combats in recent history since the Second World War. This was the site of the occupation of ISIS, where they wanted to establish an Islamic State. And so the city was occupied in 2014 through 2017, when it was quote unquote liberated, or the ISIS groups kind of got killed and kicked out of the city under kind of a coalition of the Iraqi government and Western governments, especially the United States, that used aerial bombardments and all kinds of kind of artillery to fight the remaining ISIS fighters in the city. This, for the Mosul's inhabitants, the images of the earthquake were somewhat uncanny. It kind of reminded them of the scenes that they kind of had to deal with over the past 6 years of destruction due to these campaigns that happened at that time. Some of the really incredible aftermath of that war has been the killing of around maybe 8,000 to 12,000 people. There are 700,000 people who got displaced out of their homes, almost half of the city's inhabitants. The city is around 2 million. Around 130,000 homes got destroyed, neighborhoods got razed completely, and the amount of rubble and waste in the city, around 8 to 12 million tons, will require almost a decade to be cleaned up. And what really is troubling about this event is that until now, the American government and the Iraqi government both are unwilling to open a really serious investigation to kind of document the number of those who were killed, or to do a proper survey of the damage done to the city. And one of the things that were very interesting about this urban conflict is its centeredness around healthcare. Actually, the beginning of the war and the end of the war was very much happened around this major medical complex in the city of Mosul. It's called Al-Shifa Medical Complex. It's the second largest hospital in Iraq. It kind of services around 600. One of the main buildings services around 600 patients. And this is the image, the satellite image before. It's over there. You can see this is where the Shifa Center is, and this is the image after the combat. This is the Al-Shifa Hospital, the second largest hospital in Iraq, which basically a lot of the ISIS fighters kind of went into that hospital with their injured. That was the kind of whenever I talk with people, they will point to this hospital and say, this is where the last fight with ISIS happened. When in Mosul, I interviewed Dr. Zakaria, a 28-year-old young physician who is very active, very energetic, who had kind of worked in this hospital called As-Salam Hospital during most of the occupation of ISIS and during the combat that took place afterwards. Zakaria is an orthopedic surgeon, actually a resident in orthopedic surgery. And during the time of the military assault, he was the only orthopedic surgeon working in this hospital, servicing all the patients coming in from the injuries. And when I was talking to him about what kind of the gruesome things that he had seen, he said, one day I had around 21 amputations done. I did 21 amputations, and that was my big record. Now, Zakaria, in addition to his public work in the public sector, he has actually joined this operation of MSF Brussels. The group has been working in the eastern side of Mosul, on the eastern side of Mosul, to kind of work on complex war injuries. After the war, there were tens of thousands of people who were injured, and many of these injuries were actually not healing properly. So either bone infections, either infections, skin infections kind of recurring. So many of them had these open wounds that were not really healing quickly. So if you see in the background of this compound, this is Al-Salam Hospital that's being rebuilt. This is a new picture. And these are kind of makeshift kind of settings for the hospital. The hospital, as I said, has been dealing with this increased number of infections, specifically infections with antibiotic resistance. And these are mainly superbugs that are resistant to many of the kind of usual antibiotics that we use in kind of everyday medical care. When I was visiting the hospital, Zakaria and his colleagues brought this slide out to me, and they showed me what the scale of the resistance problem there. So if you see on the left side, these are the names of the bacteria that they were seeing, the MRSA, methicillin resistant staphylococcus, for those who know this name. It's a very kind of pathogenic bacteria that causes infections and osteomyelitis. And if you look at many of these antibiotics, for example, many of the bacteria here is resistant to many of this list of antibiotics that are available in the market. So for many of these doctors, there is a major problem in Mosul. Many of the antibiotics that are available are not necessarily addressing these infections, and so there's a lot of special care is needed, special rehabilitation. This MSF center does not only do osteomyelitis and reconstructive surgery, but also does mental health and other kind of post-trauma healthcare delivery. And if you see the kind of from the inside, the hospital is divided into these kind of separate, almost quarantined rooms where patients are separated, and there are very specific protocols of introducing antibiotics and the use of antibiotics amongst these surgical cases. This is the only hospital probably in Iraq and at least in Mosul that I know of that uses a very proper protocol of antibiotic stewardship or antibiotic kind of management. Other places, the situation is very more random, and it's more haphazard. So, and I'll come to talk about this later on in this presentation. However, Mosul's case is not necessarily a new thing. This problem has been raging across the Middle East, across the different conflict settings in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, in Lebanon. All of these countries, all of these healthcare systems have been reporting the rise of these invincible bacteria, these superbugs that are becoming very much associated with the conflicts that are unfolding across the region. And if we just look at a kind of a recent report from the Lancet about MRSA, about the methicillin-resistant staphylococcus, we see that this is where this red zone over here, I can zoom it over here, it's Iraq and Syria, are kind of one of the highest reported rates of these resistant bugs across the world. So one of the things that I want to do in this talk is kind of speak about what I call these episodes of war biology. And these are kind of experiences that, or at least like part of the research that I've done involves experiences I've had as a physician, research and ethnographic work that I've done on these different war injuries, these reportings of antibiotic resistance, and also partly is my kind of experience as a physician working in Iraq during the 1990s and dealing with the kind of the collapsed healthcare system at the time. So this is what kind of I'm trying to kind of capture here is what I'm calling these afterlives of these wars, and if we can use that term to describe this. So as I said, these are like there are multiple sources. The way I'm thinking about this, that's to do with my own kind of living in this region and covering a lot of that, covering a lot of these problems as a practitioner, but also as a kind of an involved anthropologist. And one of the main ideas that I want to kind of bring here is this kind of very intimate relationship between the social and the biological. And in many ways, thinking about biology through kind of this local perspective. So rather than kind of taking biology as a kind of a universal and a standard, through a universal and standard framework, focusing more on the particular and the local could actually allow us to understand more how environments shape the human condition. And finally here, I want to kind of think about how, as a medical anthropologist, or how can medical anthropology and social science and the humanities in general inform medical hypotheses or inform planetary health questions or planetary health problems. Especially in places like the Middle East where scientific data and scientific work is either politically contested or kind of really unavailable due to these different kind of wars. So the idea that I'm kind of really trying to work with here is what I'm calling war biology. And this is kind of a broad rubric that I'm utilizing to describe many things. The first thing is it's a kind of an analytic that I'm using to think about the kind of how war or war wounding is registered in human and non-human life. The second kind of way to think about war biology is a kind of almost like a set of problems, questions, and phenomena that allow us to interrogate or think about how war is driving these biosocial problems and how we can kind of understand or address and archive the consequences of these long-term wars or the kind of the immediate, the visible, and the invisible impact of these wars. And finally, what I kind of think about war biology is more of a kind of a call to kind of an interdisciplinary collaboration, a way to think together as social scientists, as historians, as people who work within the sciences, to address very pressing problems of our times, really related to questions around our planet and related to kind of our health as a species and the health of all species around us. Now, to to begin the story that I've been kind of tracing for the past decades, is I'm going to tell you this mystery story of what is being called Iraqi Bacter. So before doing that, I'd like to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of this kind of biology of history of antibiotic resistance. The relationship between war and antibiotic resistance is not necessarily new. Actually, antibiotics were first time used on a population level during the Second World War. It was given to soldiers in the US and in Europe to prevent wound infections. And there were all these different advertisements back then to celebrate this kind of miracle drug, this magic bullet that was really bringing the soldiers back home. The penicillin that was kind of used at that time really did a lot of wonders. It definitely prevented a lot of wound infections, but it also cured a lot of sexually transmitted diseases like gonorrhea and syphilis. And that kind of really freed up much of the constrained labor that was being under stress during the wartime. And if we look at kind of a brief history of antibiotics and the resistance, we can see that kind of after the Second World War, there has been this kind of major scaling up of the industrial production of antibiotics. And in the 1950s, antibiotics began being used in animal farming. They were used as supplements to increase kind of to improve the health of the animals and of course increase the production. And over these decades, what we see is as a kind of a period of production of new antibiotics. However, in kind of the late 1980s, pharmaceutical companies stopped producing antibiotics. However, the production of antibiotics increases dramatically. So over the past 20 years, from the year 2000 until now, the use of antibiotics has increased about 40%. And most of this increase has been happening in lower income and middle income and lower income countries across the world. And if we look at this other kind of timeline, we can see that antibiotic resistance is not necessarily a new thing. It's not like we're suddenly dealing with resistance in this day and age, but actually every time an antibiotic was introduced, very soon after that, resistance begins to be reported in healthcare settings. So this problem has been there for a long time, but the scale of it has kind of been magnified over the past decades. One thing that I want us to kind of think about here, it's a kind of very challenging idea, is that whenever we use an antibiotic on a single body, every time you are using an antibiotic, it's an environmental event. It's a moment, there's a potential of a kind of an evolution of an emergence of a resistant bacteria in that kind of moment. And this event does not necessarily affect just you individually. It affects kind of all the people around. So antibiotics have this very unique property where the impact of it is not necessarily just on this individual body, but it definitely has to be seen through a collective lens and through kind of its effect on the environment. In 2015, the WHO really came out with an important report basically warning that if we don't address this antibiotic resistance problem, infections and death from antibiotic resistance is going to become the world's leading cause of death. It will actually surpass cancer as a cause of death, and we're going to be kind of returning to this moment or a period of pre-antibiotic era. And the cost of this is going to be tremendous. These are the 10 million deaths, and the 66 trillion pounds are just for the year 2050. This is the projected kind of projected cost of antibiotic resistance for the future. The recent COVID-19 pandemic did not necessarily help with this, mainly because in different parts of the world, antibiotics are used as part of the protocol became used as part of the protocol of treatment, although there are no kind of scientific kind of evidence that antibiotics really help with COVID. But there has been an 80% increase in antibiotic usage and around 15% increase in antibiotic resistance during the year 2020. The silver lining of the antibiotic resistance story is mainly that it actually it made us rethink the way we understand health paradigms, especially in public health and in global health. The idea of the focus on just human health has been really questioned due to the kind of the problem of resistance, and a more integrative health approach is being kind of formulated in the scientific discourses currently, and being kind of integrated with questions around climate and other kind of planetary health problems. So this is kind of a very interesting transition, and I think kind of as anthropologists we have partly a skeptic eye on this transition, but at the same time I'm very excited because it opens up the possibility of thinking about the body in a much more body and health, and the anthropos in a much more complex way. However, a lot of the writings about antibiotic resistance and the way to fight them has really barely touched the surface or scratched the surface of the problem, specifically the problem of war and militarization, and the way war has been driving much of these problems across different parts of the world. So most of the policy briefs that one reads and the WHO reports talk about antibiotic stewardship, trying to regulate irrational use of antibiotics. However, there is really very little written on the problem of how war has been driving this global and planetary health crisis. So to delve into this kind of past 20 years of story of war and antibiotic resistance, let me start with a mystery of what has been called Iraqi Bacter. In March 2003, almost 20 years ago, the US occupied Iraq. And that was not necessarily the first military intervention in Iraq. The US had kind of enjoyed a long history of interventions for the past 40 years, since the 1990s, the first Gulf War, the sanctions, 2003, the counterinsurgency operations, the ISIS war. There has been kind of a long history of military interventions in Iraq. However, in March 2003, after almost decades Iraq being under sanctions, US military doctors began reporting on stubborn wound infections among the soldiers. And this infection many of these soldiers were being triaged in this archipelago of field hospitals in the US, and then eventually they are flown back to Germany or to the United States for kind of more surgical treatment. However, along with the evacuation lines and these wounded soldiers, this bacteria, this stubborn bacteria, was kind of moving all the way back to the US, and in the US it was infecting people who have never seen a war zone before. And the culprit was a bacteria called Acinetobacter baumannii. And the name Acinetobacter comes from the Greek. Aceneto means kind of amotile. It's a sluggish bacteria, very slow, doesn't move very fast. It actually exists in the environment. It exists in soil, it exists on our skin, and it usually doesn't affect healthy people. But it actually becomes an opportunistic infection, especially in healthcare settings, when it acquires resistance and infects either people with wounds or infects immunocompromised patients or ICU patients. So it is what is called an opportunistic infection. It is it's been kind of associated every now and then. There is a kind of an epidemic of it happening sometimes in war settings or in disaster area settings. So in the 1999 earthquake in Marmara in Turkey, there were these reports of this. There were also reports of this in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait after the first Gulf War. And what is really kind of notorious about this bacteria is its ability to acquire resistance and become a reservoir for many resistant genes and passing it to other bacteria also. So if you can see this graph of the reports of the Acinetobacter amongst the US soldiers, you can see that kind of the resistance of this bacteria increases from 2003 all the way to 2017 to become almost 100% resistant to antibiotic. And for kind of a simple kind of science session here, for bacteria acquires resistance mainly in two kinds of ways. One is called a vertical gene transfer, and this is when a kind of a parent bacteria give the resistant gene to the offspring. So this is kind of also, we pass our own genes to our offsprings the same way. That this kind of, it's a vertical gene transfer. But bacteria has this other feature. It's called horizontal gene transfer. So bacteria from even sometimes different species, they can actually come next to each other and squirt DNA material and information into each other. And so they could, like Acinetobacter could actually give a plasmid that has a resistant gene to an E. coli. So this other bacteria could actually have the same resistant gene that Acinetobacter had. So this is a very different way of gene exchange. So Acinetobacter actually is kind of a master of this process. It also has this capacity to form a biofilm. And a biofilm is like different kind of bacteria congregate next to each other, and they form like a kind of a colony. And through this colony, through this kind of intimacy, they exchange this information with each other, so they all become very quickly resistant. And at the same time, this kind of viscosity of this biofilm becomes really, it allows the bacteria to stay on like hard surfaces, so it kind of lingers on doorknobs, on stethoscopes, on tables in the hospital. So it becomes a kind of a very dangerous and very difficult to clean. And actually, even there are reports of this bacteria surviving in cleaning detergents. So it's a very tough bacteria, and that's why it is considered actually one of the top priorities for the WHO to address in terms of research and development. So after a year of the occupation, in November 2004, the CDC began to kind of set a kind of a task force to investigate the source of this infection amongst the U.S. military. So it basically did this investigation trying to figure out if the infection is coming from the environment, from the Iraqi soil, or it's coming from the healthcare settings in U.S. hospitals, or it's coming from the skin of the soldiers or of the Iraqi patients who were treated in these field hospitals. The report actually ruled out environmental causes, and it actually found that most of the samples coming from the field hospitals were all contaminated. However, they also noticed that the Iraqis treated in these hospitals had a little bit higher skin colonization levels than the US soldiers. So the report kind of, with all the kind of the ambiguous data that it was collecting, argued that these kind of findings that non-US patients who presented to field hospitals had higher skin suggested that the possibility that these patients who typically experienced longer hospital stays and moved between these US and Iraqi hospitals may have been the kind of the introducers or the reservoir of this infection. Over this next years, Acinetobacter becomes this kind of major sensation in US media. And all kinds of journals, all kinds of newspapers begin to report on this mysterious infection, the Iraq infection, the invisible enemy that is haunting the bodies of the, or it's kind of affecting the bodies of the U.S. soldiers and moving all the way to the United States. And in the U.S. Hospitals, the term Iraqi bacter becomes a moniker to describe this bacteria that is kind of moving with the soldiers from Iraq to the United States. And there are all these different myths about why people are getting this infection. Some people were saying that, you know, the insurgents are smearing these bombs with animal shit and animal bodies, and all kinds of mythical stories were attributed to this bacteria. And there's all these kind of conspiracy theory websites that have been kind of talking about this bacteria and looking at how this bacteria have been moving to the United States. There has been also many memoirs and accounts written by even global health specialists, kind of describing this bacteria as through this moniker Iraqi bacter. So while the scientific and the media discourses converged around the dangers yet mystery of the Iraqi bacter, there was little really discussion beyond the body of the occupying soldier and the U.S. civilians bystander. There also seems to be less concerns about the popularization of the name Iraqi bacter. The simplistic accusation leveled against the Iraqi bodies, deemed as the introducers and the reservoir of the infection, further obscured the full story and inquiry into the possible histories of this infection. And it kind of echoes a lot of that tropical medicine discourses that many of us historians and of medicine kind of read about. It also kind of echoes what the late global health physician Paul Farmer, Harvard physician Paul Farmer, called a geography of blame, when he kind of discussed how Haitian bodies became accused or they became the object of accusation for bringing HIV/AIDS epidemic into the United States. However, for me, as a medical anthropologist, this issue of representational disputes and representational politics was not really kind of where I was trying to take this conversation. My interest was really asking the question, what is Iraqi about Iraqi bacter? When wounds travel. So in January 2011, I arrived to Beirut to start my kind of first academic job at the American University. And I literally arrived 3 days before the beginning of what it was later called the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings, the protests that kind of took over the Middle East like a contagion. And soon after, this problem kind of went sour. The war on terror was ongoing in Iraq. There were like displacement of many millions of people happening over the past decades of the invasion, and also this became more augmented by the Syrian war. And what really triggered, we kind of began writing as an anthropologist and as a kind of a physician, a public health person, began writing about how the movement of patients and refugees was changing the healthcare geography and the healthcare landscape across this region of the east of the Mediterranean. In Baghdad, suicide bombings, counterinsurgency operations were kind of punctuating everyday life. This is kind of a very telling map that The Guardian published in 2014, showing actually each of these red dots represent conflict-related fatal incidents. So at least one person died in one of these instances. So and this could be a car bomb, it could be a kind of a military operation. But imagine behind all these red dots, how many injured people and disabled people are not necessarily shown in this graph. So in Beirut, at the American University, I began to see with my colleagues a lot of Iraqis arriving to the hospital to seek healthcare. They were also kind of moving across the region. They were moving from Iraq to Iran to India to Jordan to Turkey to Beirut. So whenever we are seeing these patients, they have already been roaming around, moving across all this different kind of healthcare landscape. So the problem of some of these wounds were not that many of them were also not necessarily individual. Sometimes an entire family is affected by a car bomb or by a suicide bomb or by an attack on a home. And so we witnessed, or at least I've been kind of documenting the stories and experiences of many of these patients who are moving, struggling to figure out how to care for family members. Many of these people did not necessarily have money. They had to kind of mobilize many of their kind of social resources, kinship, tribes, militias, and even the state, trying to figure out ways to get money to travel and seek care outside the country. The entire system had collapsed in Iraq, or at least no one had necessarily trust in the medical doctors who were working there. And for this kind of period, I began to really interested in this notion of the wound. To think about the wound not necessarily just as a literal physical injury, but also as a kind of a metaphor for the kind of the social body, and a way to think also about symbolically how a place like Iraq, especially kind of through religious ritual, the kind of the self-injury or self-inflicted injuries during the Ashura rituals were kind of very much speaking to this kind of epidemic or this kind of spread of wounding or of this assault on the body that has kind of dominated this life world of these patients and civilians. But one of the things that kept on bringing me back to the biological question is the experience of many of these doctors who were really challenged by what they were seeing of these Iraqi patients. So there were higher rates of cancer among younger patients. There were also a kind of high resistance bacterial infections associated with the wounds of these traveling patients. So at that time, we tried to figure out how to respond to this. My colleague and I, who's a plastic surgeon, we founded this center called the Conflict Medicine Program. And through the center, we tried to focus on kind of this idea of the wound as an entry into kind of narrating this kind of relationship between war and medicine. And one of the things we began to do these analyses within the hospital and outside the hospital, speaking with all these different experts about the cases that we were seeing, what we at least saw that this bacteria, this Acinetobacter, was definitely more widespread among the Iraqi patients who are coming to the hospital. That at least half of the patients that we were seeing there had multi-drug resistance, and half of those patients were infected with Acinetobacter. But it's still the question about what is Iraqi about this Iraqi bacteria was not very necessarily clear. So over the next years, I tried to reach out to many of colleagues that I know, scientists and anthropologists, people in microbiologists, environmental scientists, to kind of come together to think about how to address this problem and how to think about how war has been driving these antimicrobial resistance problems. So we put a team, and we kind of began to design these multidisciplinary research kind of workflows. There were people planning to do research in the clinical settings, people going to the environmental settings, gathering samples from there, people who were kind of looking at bacteriological analysis, phylogenetic analysis. So all in all is to find ways and find pathways of how how war has been driving these problems. We did apply for a number of grants. We didn't get many of them. and the problem also of COVID that kind of completely kind of killed any kind of alternative research at that time. Now, though my colleagues have been kind of reigniting the work and working rather than on kind of a complete project, working through these different piecemeal approaches. And what we really have been kind of looking through at this point, and this is kind of ongoing research that is kind of captures where we are at in this project, is two main hypotheses. So one hypothesis, it has to do with what I can call antibiotic anarchy. And this has to do a lot with the changes in the practices of wound care that was happening in Iraq in the 1990s. As a doctor working in Iraq in a completely collapsed healthcare system, myself and other physicians began to use broad spectrum antibiotics on all the patients that we were seeing, at least in the surgical ward. And this was a way to to save the lives of the patients. But over time, this practice seems to have kind of continued to dominate the culture of Iraqi medicine until today. And of course, the other kind of problem is the overprescription of antibiotics and the kind of the commercial medicine sector that has emerged in the collapse of the public health sector in the country. So there are these huge medical scams happening in Iraq where medications, especially even antibiotics, are overprescribed to patients in pharmacies. Even injection antibiotics that are usually not given in a pharmacy, they are being given in such a private setting, which is really unheard of in other kind of places. The second hypothesis has to do with environmental toxicity, and this really came from kind of as a surprise for us because there was really this very interesting research showing how heavy metal contamination in the environment is causing antibiotic resistance in the environment. So this is really, it's very clear that places like Iraq and Syria are really major problems in terms of the debris and in terms of the toxicities of the munition used and of the kind of the collapse of that lived environment, the heavy metals that exist in cement and all, and of course the destruction of industry, of agriculture. And the process through which this happens is something called cross-resistance. So a heavy metal of the bacteria that gets kind of stressed by a heavy metal develops resistance to that heavy metal through, let's say, a pump that gets activated on the wall of that bacteria. That same pump actually pumps out also antibiotics. So the question here, to what extent these heavy metal contaminations in these war environments are also driving antibiotic resistance in soil and in water. So this is kind of an ongoing project that some of my colleagues are also doing right now. The third kind of arm of this project is kind of archiving bacteria from these different conflict settings and using bacteria to think about how we can kind of connect microbial time with political time. So if we can kind of create these kind of phylogenetic trees, to what extent we can kind of project a certain kind of microbiological event on a kind of a larger political event. It's a kind of an ambitious project, but this is kind of something that we are trying to develop and sequence, and as people are sequencing these thousands of bacterial samples that are found in hospitals and are kind of being sampled from different other places. So let me kind of conclude here. So as we reflect on the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, the attention of the world, as well as the US war machine, seems to have kind of moved elsewhere. After a year of the start of the Russian and the Ukrainian, the Russian assault on the Ukraine, reports of cholera epidemics and the rise of antimicrobial resistance seems to invoke this that past history in the West. One of the challenges of doing this kind of political work is the kind of the politics of science and the kind of the unavailability of a lot of the data that can kind of support many of these arguments. But what I tried kind of to present today is how these kind of past decades of war in the region has been associated with these kind of visible and invisible effects on human life and on the environment. Conducting this kind of scientific work in the war zone under this highly contested political circumstances is not that easy. But I tried to show that I tried to show that this kind of long ethnographic engagement really could help us to open up questions and open up channels to do kind of research and think about new ways of connecting the dots in understanding how war is shaping the human condition and shaping our planetary experience. So from bombing to sanctions, to full-scale invasion, to the so-called war on terror, Iraq has been kind of at the forefront of the Western interventions over these decades. These interventions have changed the very ecosystem in which people live in. The moniker Iraqi Bacter has also been used to describe this superbug that is linked to the US military casualties in Iraq and its movement back to the United States. Despite the racial overtones of linking a bacterium to Iraq, asking what is Iraqi about Iraqi Bacter reveals a complex war biology. In such contexts, Iraqi Bacter may be the culmination of many things. The decades of militarization, the wounding and the collapse of infection control and infrastructure, the movement of the injured across the region to seek healthcare, the overuse and misuse of antibiotics driven by sanctions, the proliferation of poor quality drugs and counterfeit medications, and the destruction and contamination of the natural and lived environment. Iraqi Bacter is a true war biology. It stands as an archive of a cruel history, the legacies of which runs deep through the wounds of Iraqis and the genetic makeup of their environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. We have a few questions, but do feel free to add a few more to the list. Can you tell us a bit more about how you think about the wound as an analytic? What do you mean about the social wound and symbolic wound?
Sure. Part of the work that I've done is kind of where do we start thinking about a kind of this anthropology of war, or how do we study war? Do we look at kind of political actors? Do we think about it through kind of the different economic relations? And these are all very, very important. But one of the things, at least for me as a medical anthropologist, was very important is to begin to think about a kind of the body as the kind of the, for me, the main purpose of war is to injure and out-injure the enemy. And so injury and wounding is a kind of central to the kind of, for me, the way we can think about war. And it's and the wound as a kind of, it has this kind of universal kind of register for many societies, many cultures. The term the wound is used as a metaphor to describe things from a kind of a personal injury or to a kind of an insult, or to the loss of your own country or your own society. So for me, I wanted to kind of think. To develop this idea further, to think about what do we mean when we think about the wound as a social category. Many people that I was dealing with in Iraq, people would talk about Iraq itself as a wound. They talk about their history as a wound, the kind of the displacement that they had. So for me, it's a very productive category to think with, to understand human experience, human condition, and I think it's something that is relatable to a lot of people in the world. The symbolic wound, of course, is, or the kind of the presence of the wound in Iraq or in other places kind of was pretty prevalent after the war. The explosion of the Shia rituals after the 2003, the bringing in all these kind of self-inflicted injuries as part of the ritual was kind of very telling of how the wound is something that people really think with by kind of having it as a material experience.
Mm-hmm.
And also a lot of the writings, a lot of the novels that kind of emerged out of Iraq after 2003 really was dealing with this notion of the fragmented body, the body that is not a whole, kind of the injury, the scar. So this is why I felt there is a kind of, the wound is a kind of a total social fact. You can kind of, through that, you can kind of understand these multiple levels of society and history.
Yeah, I guess following up on that, and thinking about the war in Iraq and the drama of that the country has gone through, and the war in Ukraine. So 2 questions. One is, do we see a development of antibiotic resistance in Ukraine? Do we know? And 2, we've been hearing about, the war in Iraq as a country building experience. The identity of the country is built through the war. That's the case of Ukraine. What does war do to a country like Iraq where, people have been in Iraq and in the country with that name for a little longer? Right.
I mean, I think, to answer the first part of the question, yes, there are there are reports of antibiotic resistance that are coming from the Ukraine, all kinds of problems but the kind of the sentiment, the political sentiment around that war is completely different than what you have in Iraq. There's kind of more investment in showing the effects of the war rather than concealing these effects. So that's kind of definitely one of the bigger differences that we see. It's really kind of very interesting when to think about war in Iraq, because when you say war in Iraq, what war are we talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the ISIS war? Is it the 2003 war? Is it the first Gulf War? Is it the Iran-Iraq war? There is this ambiguity about this idea of what war means and who is being asked and what kind of experience people had throughout these different decades. So definitely an experience that have shaped the everyday life of people, their imaginary of what their country could be. Today there is definitely a kind of a little bit more of a hopeful sentiment about this history, with kind of calming down of some of the violence. And of course, I would attribute all of that also to the movement of the war machine somewhere else. So a lot of the investment in pumping weapons has moved elsewhere. So there is a little bit of hope that things kind of would be calmed down, but of course it's always been a fragile situation. People experience the collapse of their lived environment daily in so many different ways.
Yeah. Another question. So you use the phrase biology of history. Why not history of biology, and what does the phrasing mean? I think
Sure, excellent
some
question.
people need more.
Sure. So if we think of a history of biology, it's a kind of usually a common term we use when to think about how bacteria was discovered, how paradigms about biology have changed over time. But when we think about what is the biology of history, this is a biology that has been transformed through our kind of historical action. Mm-hmm. So if we look today at our bacteria, the bacteria that we're dealing with is not the bacteria of 100 years ago. Yeah. All of that has been changing. So our own anthropogenic kind of activities have been changing biology. And this is all we can think about it in relationship to the climate change, to the Anthropocene. These are all related to what one could think about as the biology of history.
Correct. Yeah. One last question. Are there international efforts to slow antibiotic resistance by supporting regions with high resistance with resources to help with antibiotic stewardship? And I would add to that, why are pharmaceutical companies not interested in doing research in antibiotic resistance?
Pharmaceutical companies are not necessarily producing new antibiotics, and this has been a long story. Partly is economic, financial. Antibiotics do not really pay much because there's more investment in chronic diseases because that's something that is going to be needed all the time. Antibiotics are short courses. So there is less investment in that. Also, it seems like the more we are producing antibiotics, the more resistance we are experiencing. There are other means of dealing with antibiotic resistance. A lot of doctors are moving more to old school management of wounds locally, recurrent debridement. And there are also technologies like macrophage, which is using viruses to kill superbugs. But these are not going to be anywhere close to the antibiotic story. So the true kind of response to this is by empowering more control over the use of antibiotics globally, but also cleaning up many of these environmental problems that are also causing this phenomenon. And I'm hoping that this also is a call to a call against, to think twice before kind of militarizing and waging war anywhere in the world.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you for your wonderful presentation and for answering our questions. Thank you to our audience for listening and for asking questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe events. You can find more about past events and future events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. With that, thank you very much for joining us and have a great rest of the day.